Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Circle of Wine Writers seminars. This week, we've got Billy Abbott. Now, Billy started in IT and finance, did that for about 10 years, but eventually he saw the light and moved into writing about whiskey. First of all, on his own blog, I think in around about 2010. So that blog will be 10 years old this year. And then very shortly after that, which is when I met Billy, he started working for the Whisky Exchange, writing on their site. He now writes across the entire Elixir House group, and he does all their training as well. And Billy also writes for other magazines. He wrote for me at Whisky Quarterly when I was editing that magazine, and he writes for a lot of other people too. He also runs the Whisky Squad tastings and still has time to do his own blog. Actually, thanks to COVID-19, he has a little bit more time to do that, which is wonderful. So please let me introduce you to Billy.
Thanks very much, Colin. So, as Colin was saying, I predominantly am a whiskey person. I do drinks across the whole spectrum. I'm very much learning about wine. The wine writers are very much helping me with that. But whiskey is my original love, and it's the reason why I left behind the well-paid and sort of secure world of finance and IT to jump into whiskey. So, when it comes to whiskey, it's one of those drinks which is often, there's lots of stories around it and misconceptions, and a lot of those misconceptions come around where it gets its flavour from. So I try and teach people about whiskey and try and help them understand whiskey as part of my job. And one of those things is showing where the flavour in a whiskey comes from, because that will help you understand, when looking at a label of a bottle, what the whiskey might taste like. I work for an online retailer, and so if you're trying to tell people over the internet what something tastes like, that's quite difficult. So giving them the knowledge so that you can actually get some of that idea when you look at a bottle to work out what it's going to taste like, it's really important. So I'll just quickly share my screen. There we go. So where does whiskey get its flavour from? So starting off, what is whiskey? Whiskey is a spirit made with a base of grain. The reason why I say that is because there's lots of different types of whiskey from around the world. While you might focus on things like Scotch whiskey or Irish whiskey, there are lots of different whiskies all over the place. Anywhere where somebody has found some grain, they have probably made some whiskey. Apart from India does weird things and their laws are a bit strange, but apart from them, pretty much every that I know of at least, legal definition of whiskey says it's distilled and it uses grain as a base. So we move on to using this base of grain as the sort of starting point of how we make whiskey. But from then onwards, you can pretty much divide things up fairly standardly across the entire world. Some differences, some different ways of making it, but in general, it breaks down into these four distinct processes. So we start with our grain, and we turn it to something sugary. We take this sugary liquid, we turn it into booze. We take the booze and we distill it, which makes a spirit, and then we do stuff to it after that fact. Exactly what that is, we'll find out later on. So starting with these four different processes, you can change the way that each of these are done to add or remove or amplify or subdue different flavours at different points in the process. So these 4 points, these 4 steps in the way you make whiskey, these are the places where we can play around with flavour. And knowing a little bit about each of these will allow us to understand where the flavour comes from in the end. So first things first, we need to make our sugary liquid. So there's lots of different types of grain out there in the world, and pretty much if it's a grain, somebody has tried to make booze out of it, someone's tried to make beer, someone's tried to make whiskey. So on this big list here, we've got everything down, sort of triticale, sorghum, rice, millet, spelt, buckwheat, quinoa. Everything underneath oats in here is pretty much a very, very niche product, if people are really making commercial products at all. So the standard grain used across most whiskey around the world, the 2 grains are barley and corn, maize. Rye, wheat and oats are used in the US a bit and increasingly elsewhere, but they are not so big a thing. The main 2, barley and maize. And it's at this point in time that choosing your raw materials can change the final flavour of the whiskey. So you take your barley will normally add like a nutty type flavour to your whiskey. Maize will add a sweeter sort of buttery style. Rye will add some spiciness. Wheat and oats are generally quite soft and don't contribute too much in the flavour, more going towards texture and sort of spreading out the flavours in a whiskey. But already just from those first three, barley, maize, and rye, you've got nutty, sweet, and spicy. Really, really sort of core, distinct beginning flavors. And so with these sort of just changing the recipe that you have at the beginning, you're going to change the style of whiskey you have at the end. This is where you can start adding in flavor. But when we actually get these grains, we need to actually get sugar out of them in some way. Grain normally stores sugars as starches, and starches are not fermentable, so we can't turn them into booze. So we need to do something to the grain in order to be able to release these sugars into a form that we can use. So there's loads of different ways of doing it. The standard three ways of doing it are malting, cooking, and the use of exogenous enzymes which aren't present already. So if you malt something, you trick it into thinking it's about to grow, so it converts the starches stored within the grain into sugars. And this will change the flavor of a grain considerably. If you've tried barley before it's malted and afterwards, it gets a lot sweeter, and it also changes its texture, but it also get less of that very, very nutty flavor, and it turns into a softer, sort of creamier nuttiness. And so as you malt, not only does it change the starches, it also changes other compounds within the grain, creating new flavors. Cooking, again, very similar. You start cooking things, you change the flavors, your heat will alter the different compounds in the grain, and it would change its flavor as well. You know, potatoes aren't a particularly grainy thing, but potatoes are cooked if you're making vodka out of them. And if you try a potato before and after it's cooked, very, very different. Take porridge. If you take some oats before you've cooked them, taste them again afterwards, really, really different flavors in them. And that's the cooking process helps not only release the sugars, but also changes the flavor quite a lot. And then we come on to enzymes. If you stick a load of enzymes in with your mash, generally the enzymes are only going to start playing around with the starches. They're not going to really affect anything else. So you don't get so many of those flavors that you'll be introducing with malting and cooking. So, and again, you might get a very much cleaner flavor from the actual raw material itself, not masked by any other sort of new things that have been created. So three very different ways of processing your grain, and three ways that create very, very different flavors. And this is what you end up with. You end up with a big soupy mash that looks a little bit like really rubbish porridge, which is basically what it is. So it's smashed up grains with a load of water, and we start extracting the sugar out of those in various different ways. So at the end of this, we end up with a sugary liquid. Now we can make alcohol. So fermentation, the marvelous process which creates all of the booze that we drink pretty much. So we have our sugary liquid, we add in some yeast, or some yeast appears in some mysterious way depending on how you actually want to introduce your yeast, and it creates ethanol, CO2, heat, and a load of other stuff. And it's the other stuff that we are interested in. Ethanol, flavorless. CO2, it's bubbly. Heat, doesn't really taste of anything. But all the other stuff, that is flavor. That's the other bits of flavor we're bringing in to our beginnings of our whiskey. So it starts off with our sugary liquid, which will have flavor in it depending on how we've processed it and what the raw materials are. And now we're adding in more flavors as we create alcohol. And it's tweaking this process and playing around with the various different types of the various different factors we can change in this process, which will create different flavors. So my order here in this slide is a little bit strange because yeast strain is probably the thing you should choose first. So different yeasts will create different flavors. Some yeasts will create very, very neutral flavors, we won't add anything really at all. And this is often used in the Scotch whisky industry, for instance, just to have a very, very consistent base flavor to start with. Others will be really, really fruity and add lots of estery characteristics and add this really big fruity character nice and early. Others will amplify the malty flavor. Others will just be for high yield for ethanol. There's just lots of different types of yeast who do different things. Breweries know this quite a lot, and I know winemakers know this as well, because choosing your yeast correctly when you're not going to be distilling and other things, this is the point where you create a lot of the final flavor of your drink if you're not going further the stages. So manipulating yeasts is something that doesn't happen that much in the distilling world, but is increasingly doing so as the distillers learn from other industries and other alcohol producing industries. The fermentation environment is very important. The acidity. what other nutrients are around, how much yeast there is in comparison to how much sugar there is, temperature. All these different things will mean the yeast act in different ways. So the yeast will produce different flavour compounds depending on whether it's stressed or unstressed, whether it's got enough food, whether it doesn't have enough food, whether it's got other nutrients it can then bring in, which will help create the different compounds it needs to. So again, how you treat your yeast and how you create your fermentation, very, very important to the final flavour of your liquid, your alcoholic liquid. Length of time, because fermentation, this first equation, this is just the first part of fermentation. Once your yeast dies off, you then have other processes that happen, so secondary fermentations, bacterial fermentations and other things, as well as just the, as the yeast die, they then become part of the whole situation as well. And so it's all about how long do you leave it so it creates all the ethanol it needs to, then other flavour producing components can happen afterwards. And yeah, as it says that last one, influence of external microorganisms. So it's how clean do you keep everything? Do you want bugs from outside to jump in and create their own flavours as well? So there's lots of really cool things you can do with tweaking this. I'm a big beer fan as well, and this is the point where you get really weird stuff happening in beer. I just literally in the last hour bought myself a big box of some really, really strange wild beers, which will be, left in barrels for a couple of years just to see what happens. So fermentation, tweaking these different bits and pieces can create a load more flavour, especially the thing which people are trying to experiment with in the whiskey world at the moment is adding in fruitiness, adding in these esters at this point. Because there is definitely a push in the wider whiskey world for people looking for fruitier spirits, because when they age, they change and interact with wood and with the air and everything like that, which we'll talk about in a bit, and you create these fruitier styles of whiskey, which we used to have back in the day, but don't have so much these days. So tweaking fermentation is a place where people think we can probably get some of that fruity character coming back in. So, this is actually going to work. Yeah, there we go. There is some lovely fermenting wash at Chichibu in Japan. It gets a little bit lively, but it sits there, ferments away, creates lovely flavour. And this one, very specifically, I was having my face over it, and it was like sort of tropical fruit and apples. It's absolutely lovely. So, part of the third. So, distillation. I've mainly put this diagram in because I'm quite proud of it, because it's lots of little balls and they're all bouncing around and showing you how things are concentrated. So we start off with the liquid. When we distill, we vaporize the liquid. We then collect the vapor and condense it. And the things which are in the vapor in higher concentrations will therefore be concentrated in what we are collecting. So while this shows ethanol and water, and in the middle beaker, we can see there's more ethanol in the vapor above the beaker because ethanol has a lower boiling point, and therefore while the vapor above a boiling solution of ethanol and water will always have a mixture of both water and ethanol. Because ethanol is more volatile, has a lower boiling point, there'll be more ethanol. That's what it is. It's basically taking it and concentrating that. But also flavor comes with this, because ethanol and water are not the only things in our alcoholic liquid. There are loads of other compounds in there as well. And so our little vapor will contain ethanol, water, and other things which have similar volatilities to ethanol and the water. And so we can change the way we do our distillation, change the way we apply heat, change the way we collect to concentrate different flavors. So we are able to choose which flavors we are concentrating when we distill. We can do this in lots of different ways. This is a couple of different stills. The one on the left, that is a lovely pot still in Canada, made in Scotland, shipped over to Canada, and used by a mad Scottish man with lots of kilts, who just seems to wear a kilt all the time, even though he's in Canada. And on the right-hand side, we have a old-fashioned, but still fairly modern in comparison to the style of the other still, column still. These two stills work in a similar way, in that you heat up stuff, it vaporizes, and then it's collected. You collect the vapor. But the one on the right-hand side does this many more times across distance, whereas the one on the left does it across time. I won't go into how these work too much. I don't know how much you guys know about distillation, but it can get very complex and very, very interesting. But using these two different stills in different ways, we can create different styles of spirit and concentrate different flavors. So the still on the left, the pot still. Pot stills are generally better known for creating heavier spirits. They can't produce as high strength spirits. You can't separate out the alcohol as much as you can in a column still, which means that you bring over lots more flavors. And so the heavier spirits you'll get from a pot still will have a lot more flavor in. But even then, you can choose when to collect your alcoholic liquid, choose when to collect your spirit, and that will allow you to, again, choose what flavors you want, because the flavor will change during a run of a still. Still on the other side, you can choose your strength, you can choose your which flavors you want to sort of pull out by just choosing where in the still you want to extract the liquid. So again, you have this ability to get very high strength spirits from a column still, but you can also get lower strength spirits with a lot more character to them. It all just depends how you run your still and where you collect your things from. So distillation, while we are removing a load of flavor, by the very nature of distillation, it's a destructive process. It's heating up a liquid with loads of flavor in and selecting certain pieces of it and leaving other bits behind. But even within that destructive and selecting process, we can choose the flavors that we want to come through. So generally, if you see a pot still whiskey, which is all the single malts in Scotland, most of the single malts around the world, you're generally going to get a weightier, more sort of full-bodied flavour than if you have a grain whiskey from Scotland, which are almost all distilled in a column still to a much higher strength and to a much sort of like lighter style. So again, single malt and single grain you might see on a bottle of whiskey, they don't necessarily tell you loads and loads about their flavour, but generally you can tell a little bit about the style of the whiskey just because of the way they've been distilled. So post-distillation, this is the bit that most people think is most important, and often is, but the other bits I wanted to focus on, they're the things people don't know about so much. Post-distillation though, a cask. If you drink whiskey from Scotland, you know all about casks, or at least you may think you do know all about casks. So stuff goes into casks, stuff goes out of casks while whiskey's maturing. Whiskey by law in Scotland has to mature for at least 3 years. It goes in as a colourless liquid straight off the still or diluted, and then comes out with a load of colour. And that's because we have a load of colour and flavour coming from the wood itself. Also, we have the char on the inside of the cask removing flavours. As the wood itself not only gives to the liquid, it filters stuff out as well. As liquid goes into the cask and out again through a charred layer on the inside, acts like a filter, like a Brita water filter really, and pulls out some flavours. Oxygen gets in, and oxygen's a sneaky thing. You can get in almost anywhere, and it has loads of effect on the liquid in the cask as well. It will have oxidative reactions, which will create flavours and change the way the whiskey tastes. Also, we'll have stuff leaving the cask. Casks themselves are porous, and therefore stuff will evaporate and will lose some of the liquid, and from that will change the flavour as well. So the type of cask is important. First things first, size. These are 3 casks outside of Ben Romick Distillery up in Scotland. These are 3 standard casks you'll find pretty much across the whole of Scotch whisky and a lot of whisky around the world. The barrel, the American standard barrel at 200 litres, that's what they use in the USA for pretty much all, that's their standard size of a larger cask. They use lots of little casks these days in some of the distilleries, but 200 litres is standard size. Hogshead, often remade from barrels. Take a couple of barrels, stick some of the staves together, make a slightly bigger barrel, and you've got a hogshead. But it's also a specific old school size as well. 230 to 250 litres normally, depending on how they've been made. And a butt, that's a sherry butt. It's based on the old traditional sherry butt, and while these days there's not a lot of sherry coming out, well, there's no sherry coming out of Spain in butts, they're still made and they're still treated down in Jerez to create sherry butts for the Scotch whisky industry. But the different sizes mean there's going to be a different ratio of liquid to surface area. So the larger the cask, the less surface area of wood there is to touch the spirit. So a larger cask will have less effect on the whisky itself. Just the cask, the wood, will have less effect. A tiny cask will have massive amounts of wood to spirit, and therefore will have a lot more of an effect on the flavour. But also we have what was in the cask previously. So Gonzalez Biers La Concha here, this is sherry casks at Bunnahabhain Distillery. Bunnahabhain do lots of nice big rich whiskies, and if you fill your spirit into a cask that used to have sherry in, it's going to pull out some of that sherry richness and those sort of like big rich flavors you get from sherry. Also, sherry will have removed some of the flavors from the wood already, so you won't get so much wood influence. And what wood influence you do get is the stuff that the sherry hasn't already extracted itself. But you also get people using things like chem casks, lots of different types of wine casks, lots of different types of spirit casks as well. So rum, brandy, those sort of casks used quite often. But also the fortified wines, like port pops up quite a lot recently as well. But we're specifically picking up this one because Bruichladdich had this habit of using lots and lots of wine casks. And through former owner Mark Rainier's wine connections, they managed to get a lot of interesting casks. They also have lots of strange casks, like this Precision Pest Management Solutions cask, which I'm not entirely certain what sort of cask it is. But one day, the people of the Precision Pest Management Solutions will have some lovely whiskey. So those are the four sort of areas, sort of main areas where whiskey's flavour sort of pops up. We have, right from the beginning, the raw materials and how you process them, how you then ferment that, how you create your alcoholic liquid, how you distill it, and then what you do after your distillation. And the thing, people apply lots of different numbers to these different things. I've heard recently people talking about how 60% of a whiskey's flavour comes from its cask, or sort of things like, oh yeah, the fermentation, that doesn't really add anything. Or the thing which has come up a lot recently is, does the type of barley, does the flavour of your grain, does that have any particular effect on the end product? And so there's lots of discussions, lots of arguments on the internet, as ever, about the various different processes and their importance. But I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and one thing they said really sort of struck me and sort of really sort of summed it up. Talk about casks, saying 60%, that's all rubbish. A cask affects 100% of the whiskey in the cask. Every single stage of the process affects the whole liquid. Every single step of the way as you go through your process will add in things into your final flavour. So everything affects everything. It just may not do it to a great extent. So again, if you know how your whiskey is made, know what it's made up of, and know a little bit about it, you can pull apart those flavours and you'll know what to expect in your whiskey when you open up a bottle and have a drink. So I think that is 28 minutes. There we go, Colin. You said 25. I've done you 25. But does anybody have any questions?
I'm just going to, could you unshare the screen?
I will do, actually. Sorry.
And then we can see everybody.
Okay, there we go. Hello, lovely people.
Great. And rather than everyone piling in, if you could put your hand up and I'll unmute you, and then, okay, there we go. Thanks, Christos. Off you go.
Billy, hi. One of the things that you haven't mentioned is water, and I've read, people say, oh, the water makes such a difference. So, you'll say like Glenlivet, that they get their water from this stream and it's this pure and that affects the difference. So your comments on that. And secondly, I was thinking of something like one of my favourite whiskies, Highland Park, where I've currently got some 18, some 12, and the Valkyrie, which has got a very different flavour profile to me, much more smoky and sort of robust. So looking at your comment, what you've told us so far, how would you explain the differences in different Highland Park? Obviously, the barrel aging, or do they do something different to the spirit at the beginning?
It's a bit of both. Going at the first one first, thank you very much, because I was sitting here thinking, do I mention the water, or do I expect the first question to be about water? So thank you very much. You have fulfilled my need to talk about it. Water is part of that first step. It's also part of every other step as well. But that first step, the bit where people talk about how important their water is, that's your processing of your grain into a sugary liquid. And while it's not quite the, oh yes, and you can taste the water in the final product, the water is another one of those things where it will create the environment for fermentation. It will have already had a serious effect on the way that you've extracted your sugars from your barley, so from your grain. So water is important in that it is part of the process of creating those different layers of flavour at various different points. But it's not important if you have water that is muddy, you're not going to get something that tastes muddy at the end. It's not a direct flavour transfer. I think the best example of this is on Islay. If you turn on a tap on certain parts of Islay, the water comes out brown. and it tastes like peat. It tastes a little bit peaty, a little bit muddy. However, if you use peaty water to make whiskey, you're not going to make peaty whiskey, because that's not how that flavour gets in there. And actually, what you're going to be doing is you have the suspended peat and the suspended particulates in the water, and they will affect the extraction process and the fermentation process, but not going to add a smokiness in there. So water is really important, but it is not important in the way that the average brand ambassador might tell you when you're standing at a stand. They go, "Oh yes, you should see our water source. It's so beautiful. It's surrounded by these trees." And yeah, having a good source of water is important for that. On the Highland Park side, they generally do a single spirit. Most whiskey distilleries in Scotland, although more and more they're doing multiple spirits these days, they'll have a single spirit that they produce consistently at all times. And there's a lot of work goes into ensuring that the output from the still is the same every single time, so that it's predictable when they put it into casks. Highland Park have done in the past different levels of peatiness in their spirit, because they malt some of their barley at the distillery itself, and they use peat in that malting process to add some smokiness into the barley. However, they've also done experiments using mainland bought-in malt, which has been peated. Normally, they'll do all their peated stuff at Highland Park, and they'll buy in other malt from elsewhere to do fulfill the rest of their needs. But they've also used some of those, and so I'm not sure if they've used it in Valkyrie or the other ones, but they've used it in, I think it was Loki, which was a release from about 6-7 years ago now, I think, where it was a lot different, very, very different in its smokiness, because it was using a different source of peat and it was using a different style of peated barley. So I know Highland Park do have these casks knocking around in various different places of different spirit, but the rest of it will be just manipulation of cask, because they will move stuff from cask to cask, they will taste things, and if the cask is not doing what they want it to, they'll move it to a different cask. So there's a constant management of the casks to create the flavour profiles they need to be able to combine them to create the whiskies they want to down the line. So yeah, in the end, you probably find that most of it is just them playing with casks and using the casks to sort of amplify the flavours they want to in the spirit.
Great, thanks, Willie. I've got another question here, actually, from Angela Lloyd that says, much grain these days is GMO. Does this make any difference to the whiskey?
There are, as you can imagine, very, very differing opinions on this. I have a colleague who is allergic to GMO corn and therefore tries to avoid bourbon because she has a reaction to it. But generally, the GMO stuff comes down to yield and sort of like pest resistance and things like that, and doesn't seem to have affected the flavour very much. But yeah, so it's just another factor. It'll be another factor which changes your input and the way that the grain will react in that initial processing of it to extract sugars and things like that. You know, depends exactly what the GMO piece of that grain, what that has improved or changed from the original grain that was modified. But yeah.
Would you say then that the change, although there is going to be some difference, is so imperceivable to the general consumer especially, that it really doesn't make a difference to all intents and purposes?
It comes down to what the producer is attempting to do. And this is, I've changed my mind a lot about this recently from speaking to the guys at Waterford Distillery in Ireland, which Colin almost certainly would have seen some of the interesting discussions, let's just say, that pop up online around this. The guy who runs that, Mark Rainier, he is very focused on expressing the terroir of barley, and talks about the terroir of barley quite a lot. It's not a phrase which I particularly like to use because it doesn't seem to fit really with what it is. But he says that if you play around with your initial raw ingredient, you can affect the final product. And a lot of people say you can't. The way I look at it is that people spend a large amount of time and effort making it so you can't taste the difference as the input changes. Barley is a natural product, and therefore every batch of it will be slightly different. And it's the skill of the brewers and the distillers which creates a consistent spirit out of a changing input. And so they can tweak their process to ensure that changes in the barley, which generally there aren't that many changes, don't affect the final spirit. So for GMO side of things, if the distillers have the skills needed and don't want it to, and the GMO barley is not a massive change in what's been around before, they can happily make it imperceptible. That's the skill of the producers. So
great. This is a very similar question, or the two kind of lead into the other. Somebody has asked, Becky has asked, actually, no, sorry, Sue has asked, does climate, i.e. heat, have any effect on flavour?
Yes, in various different places. But again, it all comes down to how the producer wants to use that. So, an example.
Would it also depend on? Are you asking? Is it climate, as in where the barley is grown, or climate as where the whiskey is matured?
I'm asking about the conditions where the whiskey is actually made in the distillery. Whether you know, sometimes when you heat things on purpose or you keep it cooler, etc. I remember when I was learning about whiskey. So it's really what difference that makes in terms of flavours.
Again, it comes down to what the distiller wants it to, really. A classic example was Dalwhinnie. Dalwhinnie Distillery in Scotland released something called Winter's Gold a little while back. A mildly confused PR campaign, but around it they talked about how the whiskey made in winter was different to the whiskey made in summer, and how Dalwhinnie's Winter's Gold was their winter whiskey, which is a different character to the summer whiskey. If you said this to the people in the distillery, you'd probably get punched, because they spend a large amount of time ensuring the whiskey is not different between summer and winter. I was having a chat with a guy who ran a bunch of Diageo distilleries in Speyside, and someone asked him a very, very long, sort of like rambling question about this, and he got like 2 or 3 minutes worth of description, understanding, and said it basically was, "Is there a difference?" And he just looked around the room and just went, "No," and then moved on. My favourite answer ever to a question, but it really is a case of they spend a lot of effort ensuring that temperature does not affect the spirit unless they want to. So Waterford, for instance, this distillery who really focusing on the barley side of things. If they wanted to focus on seasonality at the distillery, they could. I think they have been doing that at Daft Mill in Scotland. It's a tiny distillery. They distill in the spring and in the autumn. The rest of the time, Francis, who makes the whiskey, is a farmer farming barley. And so there's a difference between the two seasons, because they're just the two times he makes whiskey. But when it comes to maturation, that's the point where climate has a big thing. So if you want to, you can temperature control your warehouses, climate control your warehouses, or you could just leave it to nature. And in Scotland, mostly they use these big Dunwich warehouses, big thick stone walls, sort of like earthen floors. Well, traditionally, this is what they would use. And that's a very constant temperature. Scotland, people might say, is like cold in winter and stuff like that, but generally it's pretty, not massive fluctuations if you look at the global scale of these things. And so Scotland's a fairly even temperature, and they have these old-fashioned warehouses. And now they have big warehouses and racked and palletized things, which are all temperature controlled. But if you go over to Canada, for instance, I was over in Victoria years ago and wandered into this warehouse, which was literally somebody's garage. They removed cars and put casks in, and they were temperature controlled because it got so incredibly cold in winter, and it was on Vancouver Island, so quite warm in summer as well. The fluctuation in temperature was so much they could control for it. But then you get people like Kavalan in Taiwan, who, because it's so incredibly hot, and I think in their warehouses it can vary in summer between about 30 degrees on the ground floor and about 50 degrees at the top of the warehouse. They use that because the heat will speed up reactions in the cask. And so you'll end up with not aging faster. People often talk about how it matures faster if it's hot. Whiskey matures at a rate of 1 second per second, because that's just the nature of the passage of time. But certain reactions will be sped up, and so it'll be different in different locations based on the environment.
Great, thank you. Completely different question here from Becky, which is single malt popular mainly because it's perceived to be better than blended or other categories?
Yes.
Yeah.
Simple answer. No, single malt is basically picked up this reputation as being the pinnacle of whiskey over the years, and that just comes from marketing campaigns, really. It is a different product, and the way that it's now come about is that you'll find other whiskies are cheaper, and therefore they're made cheaper, and therefore they're not necessarily as good, because, again, they don't cost as much money because they haven't had so much money spent in the production of them. But blended whiskey is actually probably, a better product in some cases than malt whiskies, because again, rather than just taking a single distillery's output and creating something, a blend can bring in different distilleries, so you have more of a palette to paint with. You can choose different flavors and bring them together and try and make something which is better than the sum of its parts, which you can do to some extent within a distillery with a single malt, but you don't have quite as wide a palette to paint with. So lots of it's marketing, a lot of it's sort of perception over the years, and a lot of it's actually true due to the nature of the market at the moment. But I would thoroughly recommend people look out for and try blended whiskies, and not only single malts, but also whiskies from around the world. The other types of category of whiskey you get in Scotland, so you get single grains, you get blended grains, you get blended malts, as well as single malt whiskey. Different styles using different ingredients. And there's good ones in every category. There's awful ones in every category as well. Don't worry, there's some absolutely horrible blends out there. And if you go to Tesco and buy Tesco's Everyday Value whiskey, I did some numbers on it a little while ago, and when I did it, I think it was in total of the price of the bottle of whiskey, 14 pence of it was not tax or something like that. So for the glass, the transport, the liquid, the production, everything like that was like 14p for the whole lot, including profit. So yeah, the things are made to a price point, and so depending on exactly what you're looking at, there are some really good ones in every category. And Tesco's Everyday Value whiskey was worryingly not that bad, so I wouldn't recommend buying it, but at the same time, not that bad.
So if you were going to spend 14 pence on a whiskey, that would be the one.
Oh no, it's about 11 quid, 11, 12 quid. But in the end, it's just, yeah. I have a whole spreadsheet of all these numbers, and every now and again I'll see another whiskey, look it up, and go, "You can't buy a bottle for that much money."
Yeah, I think it's 28. I think it's at £28.40, which is the duty on a litre of 100% of alcohol.
Yeah,
something like that.
So if you do 40% of a 70 cl, and then you have VAT on top, and then you take all these things, there is actually a point where there is a zero. I can't remember the price of the bottle, but I have it in my spreadsheet somewhere, which is all of this is just tax on the alcohol and VAT. And so if it's above that, then somebody's making some money somewhere, but not a lot of money. So
yeah. Do you think, apart from yield and with barley, do you think that different barley varieties have an impact as well?
This is actually something I'm waiting for a paper to come out about at the moment. The guys at Waterford have commissioned a scientific study into the effects of terroir, the way they put it, but different barley grown in different places. And the preliminary finding they sort of shared with us already is that different varieties of barley grown in different places show less variation. Different varieties of barley grown in the same place show less variation than the same variety of barley grown in two different places. So location is more important than barley variety. But that's also for modern barley varieties. Since the 1960s, barley has been bred to be consistent, to be high yielding for brewing and distilling barley, to not really have overt flavour and anything like that. When you go back to older barley strains, and there are still barley sort of like libraries out there where you can find these old grains. Excuse me. That's when you start getting a weird and wonderful spirit. Unfortunately not here today actually. I had a little teeny tiny 20-litre cask of whiskey made by the London Distillery Company, which is no longer with us. Might be in some weird form, but it's basically disappeared. But they used Plumage Archer barley, which is like a pre-1950s brewer's barley, pre-radiation experiments and all this sort of thing, where they irradiated barley to create these new strains. So it's a really old-fashioned, quite flavoursome barley. Macallan used to use Golden Promise, which was again another sort of 1960s invention, which came from Plumage Archer, I think, with a load of flavour to it. Whereas the ones we have these days have been bred specifically for high yield, disease resistance, and all these sorts of things to make it so that they are great for producing a neutral base. And that's really what they're used for. But I think the strains these days don't have much of a difference. You know, if you see the distillers from year to year, they'll switch from Optic to Odyssey and all this sort of thing. But nobody, it's one of these things that whiskey geeks always ask when we go around distilleries. It's like, oh, what sort of grain are you using? It's like, well, it's Challenger at the moment. It's like, oh, wow, actually, I'll write that down in my notebook. And I've got notebooks and notebooks full of all this stuff. and then the next year they'll change because they'll just find one which is higher yielding. So I don't think it has that much of an effect, but I'm very intrigued to see what the Waterford paper says actually about it, because I think Mike Rainier and his team were sort of pinning their hopes on different varieties would have different flavours, and they're slightly disappointed when they do interviews at the moment. They sort of go, yeah, it doesn't really have the effect we thought it would. Anyway, but there's lots of other stuff to talk about over here. So,
yeah, it's interesting what they're doing. They work, I think, each year with 40 different farms, and they just recently released the first batch from 2 different farms in 2 different bottles. And such is the sort of the interest at the moment in this whole idea of terroir. I think it took them 2 hours to sell out.
Well, at the Whisky Exchange, we had one of our sister companies is the distributor. We had, I think, the largest allocation in the UK. We sent out an email and put a link on our Facebook page. You couldn't find it on our website because our little search cache hadn't updated. So if you typed in Waterford, you couldn't find it. And I wrote a blog post which linked to the page where you could buy the bottles. It sold out in 2.5 hours, despite us really not telling that many people.
Yeah.
So it was quite impressive. And the whiskey itself, they were very different. The 2 farms, one of them is on a peninsula surrounded 3 sides by sea, and you see a picture of the barley, and it's basically on its side, blasted by wind and salt at all times. And the other one is in a forest, and it's surrounded by trees. There's no wind whatsoever. The soil is the sort of soil you get from being surrounded by forests. So rather than being sort of like, right next to the sea, sort of very, very, I think it's very sandy, the soil. And then you get this beautiful sort of rich soil in the other place. Very, very different barleys come out of them. And the whiskies in the end were also very, very different. But also Waterford put a lot of effort into trying to amplify the flavours they are finding in the different barleys. And they tweak their process to emphasize those differences. So there's an element of, they're doing the exact opposite to what the larger distilleries do, of trying to minimize those differences between different batches. They're trying to push and emphasize those differences. But at the same time, this was the first batch they did from either farm. So they didn't know really what the effects were going to be. The second batches, they have had the learnings from the first one to know what to tweak a little bit better. So both the 2 whiskies, one of them was quite nice, the other one I didn't like at all. So
okay, well, I'm looking forward to trying them.
If anyone wants to know more about that, I've written a slightly geeky blog post on the Whisky Exchange blog all about it, which seems to happen quite often when I'm interested in things. So there's loads of information over there.
Have you started writing for your own blog again, the one that you started 10 years ago?
I've had every Monday off this month because I couldn't take my holiday for some reason. I'm not entirely certain why that was, and so I just had to have holiday at home. So on occasion, there's a few more bits and pieces that popped up on there as well, sort of tasting notes and things. But again, it's one of these annoying things is that I'm sure everybody here will know. There's always other things in the way. There's always other stuff you need to do. You never quite get down to write as much as you want to. So work writing and other writing gets in the way of my massive list of stuff I need to write about weird Asian spirits. So
there's a link to your Billy's website.
Samples of Baijiu here, and I haven't quite got around to writing all my notes on them. So
you can get to a website from billyabbott.co.uk, can't you?
Yeah, you go to billyabbott.co.uk, 2 B's, 2 T's. I'm not one of the special Abbotts who only has 1 B or 1 T. Common Abbott. billyabbott.co.uk, and I've got loads of links to find me in all the other places that you would normally find me. They're all hiding on there.
We've got, that's it actually. We've got any more questions? I know a few people have had to dash out. Have we got any more questions from us here? No? Okay, well, thank you very much. Billy, that was great. My noodle is slightly baked on some of it. I'm sure I'll have more questions as time goes on. But the more I learn, the more I realise how little I know with whiskey. It's all fascinating stuff. Thank you very much to everybody else for coming along. And I hope you can make the next seminar.